guys, Matt Cobb here, another daily devotion for you. We're picking up off of last week that we started kind of a three-part section here that I was calling Humility Turns the Hinge. And we started last week, we're in James chapter 4, verses 6 through 13, I think, yeah. And we looked at the first couple of verses talking about how humility helps us move from being an enemy of God to being a friend of God. And I want to pick back up now in verses 7 through 10. We're going to look a little bit about how humility will kind of turn that hinge from us being vulnerable and far from God and susceptible to the attacks of Satan to where we can have a close relationship and a nearness to God that allows us to be protected. So I'm going to read the passage and we're going to dive in and kind of unpack things just a little bit. And so this is James chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. And so James is really kind of talking about how now that we're no longer an enemy, but we're becoming a friend of God, what does this look like? What does this mean? And his first admonition to us is to submit to God. And so he's saying, in light of all these things, let's submit to God. And this idea of this submission carries with it both a kind of a flavor of a military term of kind of being under rank and kind of the hierarchy. And, you know, if you've ever served in the military, I have not, but my father served for 20 years. And so I have much respect and love for the military community, but they have a ranking and an order of things that you have superior officers and you have subordinates. And somebody that is a first lieutenant is lower in rank than a colonel. And so if the colonel says, do this, that first lieutenant says, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, whatever the case may be. They have a responsibility to obey and to submit to that authority that's above them. It also has this flavor of kind of a monarchy system of a king and subjects. And if a king tells the subject, go do this, the subject must go do that or suffer the consequences. And so this idea of submission is recognizing the authority that we have over us in God, being the one that is in charge. And so, he says, to resist the devil, but we on our own cannot. It's only when we are submitted to God and let the authority and the power that God confers upon us as his children, it's only in that authority and power can we resist the devil and have him flee from us. And so we have to stay humble. We have to stay recognizing the position that we have under God's authority. But it's more than just this power and authority, because James talks about the relationship that must be there. He talks about to draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Now, some people have used this verse to talk about how that God will move away from us and become distant. But we don't understand the Greek language. In English, it doesn't kind of translate the same way, because what James is doing here is he's kind of using some wordplay on this word that we get to be draw near. And because of the tenses and voices that he uses, what it can be more accurately kind of described as is that as we start moving closer to God, God starts pulling us closer in. And so it's this same aspect of drawing near, but on one hand, it's those that are moving towards, and then on the other hand, it's those that are pulling towards. And so it's this working together that we're moving towards God, but God is drawing us towards him at the same time as well, too. And so it's this beautiful picture of this relationship of God and us coming together. And it's in that humility that these things happen. And then James reminds us that it's more than just moving towards it, but God is going to start changing us as well too in this process, because he talks about cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. And so I love how he talks about that it's not just our actions of cleansing the hands, the things that we do, but it's also the aspect of our motives, of the hearts, to purify our hearts. And James says God is going to work on both of us, the things that we're doing and our motives. And then verse 9 is kind of continuing this theme of repentance and it's sorrow that we're missing the mark. This aspect of miserable, mourn, weep, laughter turn to mourning, and joy to gloom. It's not saying that the Christian life is supposed to be this, oh, woe is me, I'm so sad, life was awful. It's not this Eeyore mentality, but that when we recognize how we have hurt God by our actions, by our motives, then that should naturally produce a sorrow, which then leads us to change things with God's help so that we can live the full life that God has intended for us. And being far from God is by our own choosing and by our own actions and our motives. And it's made us vulnerable and made us susceptible to Satan's attacks when we, in our sin, have separated from God. But that's the beautiful picture that James draws for us, is that in humility, we can resist the devil. We can be sorrowful. We can be repentant. We can start moving closer to God, and God will start pulling us closer into him. And then in that relationship, the nearness that we have with God gives us that protection so that Satan's schemes and attacks won't have the same kind of influence and effect on us. And so that's the wonderful thing that humility does in turning the hinge. It moves us far from God to close to God, so that we're no longer susceptible and vulnerable, but now we are protected and near. So be encouraged, guys. There are times in our lives that we're going to be wrestling with sin because we still live in a broken, fallen world. We still have that old sinful nature inside of us. But, we can draw near to God. He will pull us in closer. And that humility, recognizing the authority that we have over, is that hinge that turns the things. So be encouraged, guys. We love you guys and hope you have a great weekend, and we'll catch you next week.